This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so when we talk about economics, right? So the first question that comes out is that what is economics? Now, obviously, one thing that we can clearly understand is economics is it's something which is related to an economy, right? Now, the next question that comes out over here is that what is the economy? Now, an economy for us is, let's say, we say the Indian economy, we say the Chinese economy, we say the American economy. So for us, an economy is a- it's a it's a geographical boundary, right? But but when we think about it in terms of economics, right? Economy is not just a geographical boundary. Now, obviously, there is a geographical concept associated with it. So there is a concept of a geographical boundary or a territory, but it is not only about the it is not only about the geographical or the so it's not only a geographical boundary. It is about the economic agents. So when we talk about economics, an economy is created of a set of economic agents or economic individuals, people who are performing certain economic actions which are generating in certain economic outcomes or results. So who are these agents, right? So obviously at a very fundamental level, these are composed of two parts. One are the set of consumers and the other is the set of producers, right? Now why no how do these people or who are these consumers, who are these producers? How do we define these consumers, and how do we define these producers? What type of economic actions do they take, and how does it result in an economic activity? So let's take a very simple example. I go to a grocery store, I pay a certain amount of money, and I buy 10 kilos of rice. Now, this results in an economic transaction. Why? Because I'm giving money and that person is charging a certain price, and at that accepted price, the price which is accepted by both of us, what we are doing is we are buying the goods. So we are buying, so I'm buying that rice. Now, this is a single transaction. This is a single economic transaction. Now, the moment I do this transaction, there are certain underlying layers to this. Number one, why am I paying that money that the person has asked for to buy that rice? Because obviously, I must have my own incentive, right? And similarly, why is it that the grocer is the shop owner is selling that to me at that price? Because he has an incentive to his to his own or he has his own incentives. Now these two incentives, now it is this incentive which lies at the core of any economic activity or any economic of any economic transactions, which generates this, or which forms the heart of the subject of economics. Now when talking about incentives, there are two different kinds of incentives that we generally talk about. The first set of incentive is the selfish incentives. Incentives. Now, there are two types of incentives that we generally talk about. Number one is a selfish incentive. So, where all I am concerned about is my own well being, even at the cost of the other. right? And the second set of incentive that we have are altruistic altruistic incentives, right? Now, altruism is something which does not form the part of mainstream economics. Mainstream economics forms or mostly focuses on the selfish incentives. And a consumer has a selfish incentive of optimizing his satisfaction from the purchase, and the producer has his selfish incentives optimizing his profit from that economic transaction, right? And at what point are these two kind of interacting such that they optimize I mean, the consumer optimizes his satisfaction from the purchase, and the producer optimizes his profit from the purchase, is what economics talks about. So how do I design this transaction? How do I create that transaction, right? Such that there will be a unique price, there will be a unique quantity, and I will have the producers who are maximizing or optimizing on their selfish incentives of profit maximization, and the consumers will be optimizing on their selfish incentive of utility or their satisfaction maximization. Now, this is something which we get to see in our day-to-day world, very extensively, right? So how does this entire thing happen? Now, ideally, if you look into a traditional economic textbook, you will see that we talks about a person going to a grocery, buying certain necessities, and at a given price, and assuming that and there is a very famous assumption that the markets are perfectly structured and they are perfectly competitive. This market or the transaction realizes that there is a price at which the consumer is willing to pay, and the producer is willing to sell off his particular good, and that is demonstrated through the famous demand and supply graph, right? And that's what the selfish incentive is. However, if I translate this economics to the modern day story, right? I order food from Zomato. Now, Zomato delivers the food to me. So I have actually paid for that food, and the food gets delivered. But the transaction actually realizes at a point later than it has actually been made. So I get the food and I assess it from each and every aspect. I assess it from the packaging aspect. I see that the curry has not spilled over. The second, I see that the food is well prepared, it's well cooked. And until and unless from the point of time I have consumed the food, the transaction is not complete, because at any of these point of time, I can actually go back to Zomato and I can type a complaint. I can take a picture of a spilled over curry and I can ask for a refund, right? So for that transaction to complete, it is not only the producer satisfaction and an agreed upon price, but that product must be such that it satisfies the consumer. So the consumers, the moment I am satisfied from the food, or I maximize my satisfaction from the consumption of that food, only then is the transaction completed and closed once I give my feedback. So at each stage of this, so this is where you see how important a consumer behavior or how important a consumer satisfaction is when when you are kind of in an economic transaction, right? Now similarly, now similarly, you may have a demand for a certain item in a given restaurant, right? But that restaurant may not be having that particular product available with them. So that's the point when they give you a choice. of a refund, and or they ask you to choose an alternate product within that same price. So they give you that choice. Now that choice is again made and the transaction is completed if and only if the consumer finds the substitute and closes on the transaction. So even after this, after you have chosen an alternate product, you may not be totally satisfied because this restaurant does not have that product that you actually wanted to have. So this leaves a distaste, and this does not maximize your satisfaction. And what results in that unsatisfied maximization, in that unsatisfied consumption, is a comment in the social media under on the Zomato page. So this clearly shows that if there is a negative comment resulting out of uh, a certain exercise or a certain transaction, right, it shows that the consumer is not actually satisfied. Hence, the transaction has not been optimal. So one thing that you can clearly see is that it is mostly the uh, the transactions, they are kind of mostly demand driven. So it is very important for us to understand exactly how is it that an individual consumer would behave, right? How is it that a consumer aims to maximize their selfish satisfaction? And similarly, at the other end, it is very important to understand how is it that the producer is trying to maximize his own satisfaction, right? Now, either the entire satisfaction that the producer gets may not be only in terms of profit maximization, but in today's world, it could be a part of profit maximization, as well as it could be certain feedback impacts which the producer can use to generate future positive sentiments like reviews, feedback, comments. And in today's world, you have these concepts of like, share, subscribe. So what are these? So these are certain feedback patterns which the producer would use or which would help the producer in generating the review, even though the producer has given you a 10% cash back, right? So one thing that what I'm trying to tell you through this story is that even in today's world, even if you see that there are different kinds of transactions which are happening and you cannot relate it back to your like you will feel first after demand and supply curve, one thing is very important, right? So that transaction, that demand supply graph that you actually saw is still prevalent today. Maybe it is explained in a different manner, but that fundamental still remains over there, right? So, so this is how we are going to study our selfish incentives. So we are going to study each of the different components of the factors or the factors which affect the demand and supply of an individual, because they form the first and the most basic component of an economic analysis. We are going to talk about selfish incentives, right? We are going to talk about the producer's incentives. We are going to talk about the consumer's incentives. But while we talk about this, we will also be talking about them in respect of the modern day situations. We'll be discussing them in terms of some modern day case studies. Now, all this while that I have been talking about, I have been talking about only one individual, right? Now, when I talk about one individual, now this is a micro component and the most basic component of an economy. Now, in an economy, a household or an individual household is the most basic component of an economy, right? Now, it is the demand of each household or demand of an individual in the household which kind of determines what type of prices that will be set in the market. And as a result, as when it's given that you have multiple households, you get to see how the market would behave. On the other hand, as you move from the market and aggregate multiple markets, the results that you get to see is the macroeconomic variable, the macroeconomic impacts. So right at this outset, the incentives can be studied at two different levels. Now, there are two types of incentives that we talked about: a selfish and an altruistic incentive, right? And these incentives can be studied at two levels. One of them can be studied at a micro level, at a micro level, and the other is the one that we study at a macro level, right? So when I'm talking about the micro, studying it at the micro level, I'm talking about assessing it at the household levels or at a certain market level or at a market level. And when I talk about macro, I talk about assessing it at the economy level, at the economy level. Now, when I talk about the households and the markets and so on, right? So I'm talking about two things. So while I talk about the household and the market, I am talking about the demand and the supply. Supply, right? And when I'm talking about the macroeconomy or the macroeconomics or assessing these incentives at the macro level, I am talking about aggregate demand and aggregate supply. Aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Now the next question that comes out over here is that I have this aggregate demand curve, I have this demand supply curve, and so on. So the next question that comes out is, how do I interpret it? Is there any difference in these two graphs? Is there any difference in a demand supply curve, in aggregate demand supply curve, and so on? And if there is a difference, then the next question that we talk about is, how do we derive this demand and supply curve? And when we go ahead to talk about that, that's where a very important component of economic history kind of gets associated with us, right? Okay. So before I move on, I'll take a pause here. I'll take up questions if there are any. You can put your questions in the chat box. I'll take them up and then I'll move forward. So I'll go on mute. You can put your questions. I'll take them up and then we'll move on. Perfect. So now the question so now how do we structure our discussion? That is what is important. So first of all, we will start by talking about the microeconomic concept of demand and supply, right? So we will talk about demand and supply, and we'll talk about the different concepts relating to demand and supply, right? So that is going to be our first session of discussion. Now, what are we trying to do? So let me kind of list down the next set of so how is it that this discussion is going to proceed? List of topics, the way ahead. So first, we'll start off with the concept of the demand and supply. Supply curves. That is fine. So when I talk about the concept of demand and supply curves, what are we going to talk about over there? Interpret the demand curve. Now, it is a very common knowledge that the demand curve is negatively sloped, right? Now, over here, we will talk about concepts of, or we'll talk about this evolution of the demand curve, right? So we'll talk about the Marshallian demand curves and the Walrasian demand curves. We'll talk about the evolution of the demand curves from Marshall, Walrus. Now, this is what the demand curve is. Explain the dynamics of the demand, a demand curve. Now, what are the dynamics? So, when I talk about the dynamics of the demand curve, what I mean is the factors which affect the demand curve. The factors which affect the demand curve. Right. Now, when I talk about the factors which affect the demand curve, what does it mean? Like what type of effects? Effects of changes in the factors. They result in two types of dynamics, right? One is the movement of the demand curve, and movement along the demand, right? So this is what the next part. So this is the next part that we are going to talk about. Also, we'll talk about types of changes affecting expected versus unexpected changes. So this is nothing but what we are going to talk about is the role of expectations on demand. Right, so we'll talk about the role of expectations. And over here, right throughout, we are just talking about the microeconomics side of things. We're just trying to understand that how is it that the demand for one individual or one household will be impacted. So we are not kind of going deep to understand like at the macro level, at the micro level. We are just trying to understand how is it that a demand curve at a micro level would operate. So that is something that we are trying to develop here. Now, the next part which comes over here is the elasticity of demand. Now, this elasticity of demand has a very wide set of applications when we talk about demand curve, right? So, so there are different, so as the different factors change, factors which impact the demand change, right? The elasticity or the prices of the price of the commodity changes. Now, the responsiveness of this price to the changes in these factors is your elasticity of demand, right? Now, when I talk about this elasticity of demand, one very important thing is that we need to understand that what are the different kinds of elasticity of demand. Now, mostly when we work, right, in our day-to-day work, the most common elasticity that we generally get to see is the price elasticity, or it's the cross price elasticity, income elasticity. Now, these are the three most important factors which generally impact the demand, right? Let's say, now what is important is to understand is that where is it that this concept of elasticity of demand is used in real time, right? So over here in this particular part, we will be interrelating the kind of with some business, typical business problems, some marketing business problems. We'll be relating this concept of elasticity of demand. So we'll not only see it mathematically, we'll see it graphically, and along with that, we will also look into the core area of applying this elasticity of, right? Okay. So we'll talk about the price elasticity of demand, the income elasticity of demand, and the cross price elasticity. Now, these are some very basic formulas which we have mostly seen in our papers or when we come across our papers, right? Or in our exams. But what is interesting to observe is that how is it that these are used to price different products? They are largely used in product pricing. For example, I want to land up or I want to kind of land up in a particular, so I want to land my product in a particular market, right? what what sort of challenges can I face over there? How should I price my product? So in that case, so I need to understand whether it's a substitute or a complement of what is coming in. So what is the type of income brand? What is the kind of the so whether the good is byproduct, is it a necessity or a luxury good, and so on. So there are different factors which needs to be taken into account, right? And due to similarly, we also look into one fact that if the expectation changes, expectation of the demand changes, we also need to understand how is it that the demand, the price elasticity of the demand would change. So that is another important topic that we would look to discuss in our subsequent sections, right? Now, having said this, the next part would be to talk about the supply curve. The supply curve. Why is the supply curve upward slope? Which type of markets do not have supply curve? Thus, identification of conditions having supply curve. The next that we talk about is the interactions of demand and supply. Interactions of the demand and the supply curves. Now, when I have talked about the interaction of the demand and the supply curve, so when is it that the price increases, the quantity increases? When is it that the price decreases and the quantity increases? So how does that happen? So that is something that we need to kind of study over here. That's what we need to understand. So what are the situations that are caused, and above all, what are the different stages of the supply curve? So we always have a look into a supply curve which is upward rising, but what possibly could be the other shapes of the supply curve, what those supply curves mean, right? So those are the situations that we are going to talk about, right? So this is immediately our next plan of action, right? So this is the next set of discussions that we are going to do. So we are first of all going to understand, so our first objective would be to understand the way the incentives are structured, right? So how is it that this might so how is it that the households so how is it that a demand supply is structured under the household system? How is it that an aggregate demand and an aggregate supply is structured at a macro level? What are the difference between the two? How does the interpretation between the two differ? And from there we'll go to talk about their respective foundations. And as we talk about that, we are going to use certain case studies which would assess help us assess this in real terms, right? So over here in these sessions we are not, so my objective would not be to stick you to only to those theoretical derivations and graphs which we have historically seen. So I would be talking about those graphs, but more importantly our objective would be to connect ourselves with those situations which we face in today's world, those economics how is it that this modern economics has changed. So that is what we are going to look into in these discussions, right? And immediately tomorrow's discussion we start it off with this concept of demand and supply curves, and this is precisely the basics of the, so this precisely is the basics of the subject, right? Okay, so Pankaj, is a question over here that do you plan to cover the type of goods and the markets? Yes, Pankaj, I plan we will be covering all the type of goods that we have. We'll be talking about necessities, we'll talk about luxuries, we'll talk about private goods, we'll talk about public goods, we'll talk about each of these, but that's at a later stage, right? First, we need to set out the fundamentals correct. So in the next 2 weeks, we will, this week and next week, we will be devoting ourselves to do that. And then on this framework, we'll kind of introduce, we'll be kind of bringing in different markets. But right at the outset, there would be a type of market that we would ideally talk about, which is called the perfectly competitive markets, right? So this is going to be the framework, because mostly the demand and the supply curve that we generally tend to talk about stand on the assumption of perfectly competitive markets, right? So we'll talk about demand and supply curves, and as we kind of cover them, as we kind of talk about their micro foundations, from there we'll go ahead and we'll discuss the role that the market, underlying market plays. What is their underlying market structure? And we will discuss more about them when we are kind of talking about, so when we are talking about the consumer behavior to, or the fundamentals of the consumer behavior to uh, to derive the demand curve. Because as we talk about demand and supply at the micro level, we will be pushing ourselves towards deriving them as well, right? So this is something that we are going to talk about from tomorrow's discussion. So today my objective was just to kind of get you guys going, right? Just get you acquainted with the platform and the mode of the demonstration. The full-fledged discussion initiates tomorrow. So tomorrow I'll send out the link at around 10:15 a.m. and by 10:15, so that you can join by 10:30 and we'll get started by 10:30:35, right? And tomorrow onwards we'll start talking about these microeconomic, core microeconomic concepts, right? So guys, thanks a lot for your time. So we'll start with our technical discussions tomorrow, and I hope to see each and every one of you over here tomorrow, and let's kind of take the show forward. Hope it benefits you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you,
Thank you,
sir.
everyone. Thanks a lot, Pankaj. Thanks a lot, everyone, and hope to see you back tomorrow. Bye bye.
Bye bye.